March 2020. His research focuses on economic policy, finance, new political economy, and the economic analysis of law. Professor Feld is with us today here in Freiburg. Virtually with us is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the 2001 Nobel laureate in economics. He served as chair of US President Bill Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. He took over as chief economist of the World Bank in 1997, a position he held until 2000. Professor Stiglitz is currently professor at and chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University in New York, having taught at Princeton, Stanford, and MIT. He holds more than, I hope this figure is correct, 40 honorary doctorates. Takes 5 minutes to list them all. When his, I believe, latest book appeared, People, Power, and Profits, the New York Times called him an economist who believes only government can save capitalism. Professor Stiglitz joins us by Zoom from New York. Before I turn the word to Friederike Schulte to acknowledge our co-sponsors, a comment about format. Our invitation deliberately referred to a conversation rather than a formal panel or interview. With guests of this caliber, we weren't sure a moderator was necessary or that any of us had the expertise to steer the discussion. What we are sure of is that the evening will be provocative and illuminating, and I'm honored to welcome our guests, Professor Stiglitz and Professor Feld. But before we begin, Friederike Schulte, we will briefly introduce our co-sponsors.
Thank you, Gerhard Manns, and thank you all out there for keeping the faith. Some heavy breathing over here through face masks the last half hour, and I want to just extend a thank you to all our cooperation partners who kept the good vibe out in the chat as we just read on YouTube, and who made it possible to bring these two titans of economic wisdom from both sides of the Atlantic together for a good hour. So I'm thanking all the German-American institutes that are involved in this all over Germany. DAI Sachsen in Leipzig, Amerika Haus München, DAI Saarland in Saarbrücken, Amerika Haus Nordrhein-Westfalen, das DATZ in Stuttgart, das DAI in Tübingen, die Atlantische Akademie in Rheinland-Pfalz, and I also want to thank the US Embassy in Berlin for co-sponsoring a series we're doing together called End of the American Dream or Realm oder Ende des amerikanischen Raumes. Dies ist ein Teil davon, and we're also kicking off our Transatlantic Tuesday series with this event. You can tweet if you like. Hashtag would be Transatlantic Tuesday. The German Marshall Fund is using it too, so we're in good company, I think. If you're more casual about it, someone suggested you could also use the hashtag Joe and Lars for tonight, if the gentlemen are okay with that. And in an old school and not virtual kind of way, as we used to say, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here at the offices, the premises of the Friedrich Graf von Westphalen. And I'm also happy to welcome Joseph Stiglitz tonight. I think that it is a wonderful opportunity, very close to the change of the US administration from Trump to Biden, but also relatively close to the turbulences we realized last week on Capitol Hill. Everybody of us who watched TV or watched the news somewhere had a look at that. So this is a very timely event, right in between these two American events that are taking place. And I think it is also a good opportunity to discuss economic issues regarding the developments at the other side of the Atlantic in the US, but also here in Europe, the prospects that we are going to have during this year and the next years to come. So welcome to all the listeners, and thank you for inviting me and inviting us to this discussion and this conversation. In preparing the conversation tonight, we agreed to have a kind of structure in 3 different steps. I think the first part of our discussion would best be simply looking at the current state of affairs in the US, but also in Europe, politically, but also economically. And Joe, if I may say so, would you like to start and give us your impression what the situation in the US is regarding politics, given what happened last year, what we are looking forward on the 20th of January, also regarding the infections, where does the US stand at the moment, and then a kind of assessment of the economic situation. Would you like to start?
Sure, let me begin with the assessment of the economic situation. And there is light at the end of the tunnel. That's really good news. But the tunnel is darker than we would have hoped for the next several months. It's darker mostly because of the magnitude of the surge in COVID-19 in California, much greater than anybody could have been expected. You know, we in New York, I live in New York, and we had the big surge in March and April. The sound of sirens every 20 minutes is etched in our mind. And you look at the graphs of the country today, of the number of cases, the number of deaths, and we're an order of magnitude greater than we were in what we thought was the worst moment. So we are now in, you might say, the 3rd wave. It's a terrible wave. And the fact that the vaccine is there is so important for hope. Otherwise, we would be really in a dismal state. But all Americans, I think, are shocked at how badly the rollout of the vaccines has been. You know, in a sense, not surprised, even though I say shocked, because the Trump administration has failed every step along the way in responding to the pandemic, in developing tests, and providing masks, and social distancing. But we thought the one thing that they would do right is the vaccine. But they did not even manage the rollout of the vaccine. He's been preoccupied by this political agenda, and this is the second topic you raised, the political agenda of contesting what is a remarkably fair, fraud-free election in the midst of the enormously difficult circumstances, not just of running an election in the middle of a pandemic, but also in the context of a post office that is not functioning very well. So the conditions of having a good election were very adverse. And there have now been more than, I think, 50, 60 court hearings. And, you know, 1, 2 instances you know, human frailty is inevitable, but out of hundreds and, you know, 150 million, more than 150 million votes, to have so few cases, everybody is remarking it was a success. And have a president lying about it and undermining, even before this, he had been undermining our institutions, our democratic institutions, our independent civil service, the media as an important check on society. He'd been undermining our institutions. But to have the President of the United States instigate an attack against the Capitol, against Congress, is, as everybody says, unheard of. And, we know it'll all be over. I am confident that there will be a peaceful transition, or at least a transition in power on January 20th. Biden is put together a really professional, experienced team, and a return to decency in the United States is really important. There will be more assistance to the economy because we are going to need it. So I think in that sense, this is a really hopeful moment, but we are digging ourselves out from a very, very deep hole.
Yeah, the situation in Europe is to some extent different, but to some extent it's also sobering. When you look, first of all, on the development in 2020, overall Europe did worse than the US economically, but there are strong differences between the different member countries of the European Union. When you also take into account the UK or Switzerland and so, you see that the differences are very, very strong. So for example, Germany had a similar performance as the US regarding the reduction of GDP growth. The GDP declined in Germany probably by about 5.1 or 5.2%, something like that. But in Europe, it's much more, probably about 7%. Just because countries like France, Italy, Spain, they had a much stronger shutdown in the second quarter of 2020, and therefore economic development there was much, much less than in the northern part of Europe. But also the UK, for example, did much worse than Germany and other countries in the north of Europe did. That is one part of the situation. When you're talking about the vaccine and vaccination strategies, we are also somewhat disappointed of what's going on. So first of all, the vaccine was permitted a bit later than in the US or Israel or the UK, and therefore vaccination started later. But still, the amount of doses of vaccine that have been applied, the number of shots is pretty low still. And in particular in Germany, people are very, very unsatisfied with the performance of their administration at the state level, but also at the federal level, given this vaccination. Nevertheless, what we can say in this second or third wave of the infections, the shutdown that we experience is much less severe than the one that we had in spring 2020. So for example, industry is performing pretty well. For example, in Germany, it is even increasing above the level that we have in 2019, meanwhile, just because people can continue to work in the industrial sector. Of course, in the services sector, things are much, much more complicated because of the shutdowns that apply there. And again, there's variation across the different the different member countries of the European Union. But nevertheless, we expect in the Council of Economic Advisors that Europe, also due to the vaccination, will pretty well during 2021. For Germany, we think of about GDP growth of about 3.5%, but overall Europe of about 4.5% for all the different countries. So again, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But as you say, the tunnel is pretty dark, so it's not one of these wonderfully designed tunnels that you usually find in Switzerland. It is one of these darker ones that you find in Italy or Germany, and therefore we have to wait through this difficult winter time in order to finish this next wave of infections and have the population vaccinated. I think that's very important.
Let me comment on one thing about the difference between European policy and the United States. We used what I call a bazooka. We spent a lot of money, $3 trillion on monetary policy, fiscal policy, and $3 trillion on monetary policy. So a huge amounts. But it was a bazooka. It wasn't very well designed. Europe spent much less, but was much more conscious about an issue that I felt very strongly about: keeping workers tied with their enterprise, both for reducing, you might say, the extent of vulnerability, and for making the companies in a better position to recover once the pandemic is put under control. What was done in a number of the European countries and in New Zealand, Denmark, Germany, of trying to keep the unemployment rate down and keep people attached was relatively successful. And the contrast, you saw what happened to the unemployment rate in the United States, unprecedented increase. And though it's come down from that peak, just the last month it started to increase again. So it shows you the importance of the design of policy. It's not just the amount of money you spend, but how you spend it. And the other thing that I think is important about a difference between Europe and the United States is that you began with a better system of social protection. And that made a big difference in a number of ways. One of the things that I was most concerned with is in the United States, we don't have paid sick leave. And that meant that when people came down with COVID-19, if you were poor and you're living paycheck to paycheck, you went to work, and that spread the disease. Now, Congress recognized that and said just for COVID-19, they would extend paid sick leave. They would have mandatory paid sick leave for 10 days, just for COVID-19. But then the large businesses in the United States were so selfish and so short-sighted that they lobbied to be exempt. And so almost half of all American workers were exempt. The companies that could have provided that assistance did not. And that, of course, helped spread the disease. So I think it gave you a little bit of a different flavor of the nature, both of the government system, but also the sense of social responsibility of our corporations.
Very interesting what you are saying. When we are talking about the differences between the US or Europe, we always have in mind that the European welfare states, they usually have good possibilities to have the automatic stabilizers work. And we have quite a lot of well-functioning automatic stabilizers. So there's no time lag in implementation of these types of additional spending or reductions just because of these automatisms, yeah? And that's quite important in the European case. But in addition to that, we had further measures undertaken. For example, a facilitated access to short-time working schemes in Germany, but also overall Europe. And as soon as it was realized at the EU level that some of these provisions for short-time work didn't work as well in all countries of the European Union, they finally decided to have a kind of European short-time working scheme, the SURE, the unemployment scheme that is working there. So this was one reaction that we could usually observe, but also when you think about the put to our economies and allowed firms to have access to additional liquidity, then some member countries of the European Union were also very generous in that regard. So in particular, again, Germany was very generous, giving guarantees and loans to a large extent to the firms in order to help them cope with the acute problems of the crisis. And well, then we had additional measures for small enterprises. When you think about the shutdown, it mainly affects people in the services sector, mainly the firms, restaurants, hotels, tourism, and so on. This was heavily affected, and very often you have small firms in this area. They were helped by direct payments by the government, so direct transfers paid in addition to what the automatic stabilizers are doing. And then we had additional infrastructure spending and tax measures and so on. So I think overall, what happened on both sides of the Atlantic is to some extent a strong fiscal impulse to the economies. In Europe, a bit more targeted, because we already have the automatic stabilizers, more targeted than in the US. We have much lower increases of the unemployment rate. But of course, the US is a federation and the European Union is not. So the differences in that regard are also important, and therefore the member states in Europe count more regarding fiscal policy action than the states in the US do.
Yeah, but there were some unprecedented actions that were taken by Europe that I think will affect the politics of Europe going forward. One of them was the decision to issue Eurobonds, to the 750 euro issuance of Eurobonds to help provide assistance. To me, as an outsider, that was a very historic step forward. You know, I had wanted them to do something like that in the Euro crisis in 2010-12, and they didn't take that step. And so I was very supportive of, I was very pleased they took that step. I would have liked more of the money to be in the form of grants rather than loans. I wish they had put into place a mechanism to service the debt, to repay the loans, some common European tax like a wealth tax or a digital tax or a corporate income tax. So I think there were more measures that would have helped strengthen the European Union that they could have taken, they didn't. But these were really important steps. And as you mentioned, the program that you talked about, the SURS program, was an important step that people had talked about again, something like that in the Euro crisis, but hadn't done it. And this was the case where Europe stepped up. And I think that is these are all historic steps.
Yeah, well, I think what I mentioned at the end of my previous statement, the US as a federation and the European Union in its design are pretty different to a large extent. So when you have this recovery and resilience facility of 750 billion euros, it helps to cope with the current situation, but it is only implemented as a temporary exercise. And thinking about refinancing, there are some things in discussion, perhaps also an own new resource for the EU, perhaps even in the form of a tax. But this is again very much down the road to decide on these things. And I fear that we're going to get a situation that we had in the monetary union already, that decisions are taken for the EU level without having a proper political union first. This was one of the problems we had to face during the Euro crisis, and all the hopes that monetary unification would finally lead us to political unification, well, at least until this moment, they failed. And I fear that the difficulties that we might have if the indebtedness of some of the member states of the European Monetary Union will not be reduced, that the difficulties that could arise out of that, they bring us further apart than together. This is some of the difficulties that we are facing in Europe at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you're right that certainly the hope that an economic union would accelerate a political union have been disappointed. And a structure that took away some of the instruments for adjustment and didn't put anything in its place creates a less well-functioning economics, a less well-functioning economic system. I think that's absolutely right. The discussion in the United States is changing, though, in an interesting way. You talk about debt. The discussion in the United States with the conviction that interest rates are likely to remain low for an extended period of time, as far as the eye could see, has led some a change in the debate, saying that the view about the amount of debt that a country can service and maintain fiscal and macro stability is much, much larger. So the fiscal debate in the United States has changed very dramatically, at least very strongly among the Democrats. And the view, and this goes back, it was a view that began, you might say, politically when the Republicans, Trump passed the tax cut in December of 2017 and shot up the deficit. So before the pandemic, we had a $1 trillion deficit. The Democrats said, we're not going to be in the position of letting the Republicans always increase the deficit, and then we have to be the bad guys of reducing the deficit. You know, we're supposed to be the bad guys of increasing the deficit, so the roles are reversed. So there'd already been momentum of saying, we're not going to play into that. We are going to change the uses of money. We may raise taxes on corporations, lower taxes on low-income individuals, spend more money on education and infrastructure. So we'll change how money is spent, but we're not going to be the fall guys in being reducing the deficit. But now that it looks like the interest rate is going to be at a low interest level for a long time, there is, at least among a large group, the view that we can sustain a much higher level of deficit. And you'll see that play out, I think, and that will be good in the short run, at least, because that will help us recover more robustly from the economic downturn.
Of course, by the way, I sometimes have the impression that the Republicans only oppose public debt when they are in opposition and not in the administration and leading the government.
They've been doing that for 40 years. That's been their position for 40 years. So after a party increases the deficit every time they're in office, it is hard to say that they are the party of fiscal responsibility. They
That's
are
true.
really the fiscal irresponsibility.
Yeah, I still have in mind the surging public debt during the Reagan administration, which was tremendous.
Exactly.
And then Clinton consolidated the budget, and now we have the same during the Trump administration.
And the Bush
it's the same
administration
thing.
increased the deficit too.
Yeah, definitely. So, and also the way they did it is a kind of strategically incurring higher debt in order to bind the hands of the following government, knowing that you are not going to be re-elected, or at least that you have a high probability of not being re-elected. So this is something we observe very often in other countries too. But regarding the low interest rates, I would be a bit more cautious about that. First of all, I would not rely on financial markets too much. One day they offer you still low refinancing costs, and the other day, if some new information is coming in, the refinancing costs are surging, interest rates are becoming pretty high. So this can quickly happen when you continue incurring higher and higher public debt, and then something changes, a new crisis is coming up or so, and then you are going to have a debt crisis in the next step. This might easily happen. And second, I don't know what you think about the argument that some of the long-term reasons for lower interest rates, which might be demography and globalization, that they change. For example, in Germany, the baby boomers are entering their pension age in 2025, which is soon. Yeah? And then they are not going to save to the same extent, but they will consume their savings to a larger extent. And also, when you think about globalization, we have this wave of protectionism since the financial crisis going on. This certainly also has an effect on inflation rates, or might have an effect on inflation rates, and therefore also on nominal interest rates, which is certainly important. And the third argument I often hear is, of course, we can, according to modern monetary theory, we can have the central bank simply printing the money in order to finance government debt. I'm also not convinced of that argument, of these arguments, that this is easy to do. Sooner or later, you then run into inflation, don't you think?
Yeah, so it's very interesting you raise these questions, because I've just written a paper which we're presenting this Thursday at the Peterson Institute with Bob Rubin, who used to be Secretary of Treasury, and Peter Orszag, who used to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget. And we pick up on the first two themes that you raised, namely that you just can't tell. You can't rely on interest rates remaining low forever. And the market, you can't rely on the market forecast either. We do an analysis of how uncertain, how volatile interest rates have been. And if the historical volatility continues, we could wind up in a very different situation in, say, 5 or 10 years. So you're absolutely right. You can't rely on that. The second thing, we actually discussed the issues that you raised about the various forces, some of which go one way, the one that you said that the interest rates are a temporary, the low interest rates are a temporary aberration, result of demography. Charles Goodhart has a very nice book on that that's recently come out. And globalization, there are a number of forces. There are forces going the other way. It's very clear that we have large needs for investment. Some of the reason interest rates are so low is that our financial institutions haven't been working very well. So we have a supply of savings, but we haven't had the institutions that would absorb the savings in productive investments that we need for our society. So when people talk about a savings glut, I say, you don't live in the same society I live in, where I see a shortage of savings if we could get those savings to work in the way that we need to for the infrastructure that we need, for the education that we need, for a whole host. Addressing the problem of climate change is going to need an enormous amount of investment. And so that balance between savings and investment, I'm a little bit more agnostic about. But the implication of this should be very clear in policy, that you want to maintain a kind of flexibility in policy that recognizes that things can change very quickly.
Yeah,
so one recommendation that we make is that as a shock absorber, the government ought to put more of the debt into longer-term maturities, so that if the interest rate goes up, we are somewhat protected. It makes sense if there are costs of adjustment to pay a risk premium, even. Not clear that there isn't a risk premium, but even if there were a risk premium, helping the economy absorb shocks is something we do. We buy insurance all the time to help us manage risk. And this is an instrument that would help us manage risk.
Yeah. You mentioned climate change, and this brings me to, well, actually the second part of our discussion that we wanted to look at, namely what the transition to the new administration, what the new Biden administration will change regarding international relations, in particular the relations between the European Union and the US. This holds in the first dimension regarding questions of international trade, which are also affected by, say, geostrategic rivalries when we think about the US-China trade conflict, which is only the tip of the iceberg of the overall rivalry between both superpowers. But also in the second dimension, and this is the one you mentioned, which is climate change. Actually, we need an international agreement, a binding international agreement to reduce CO2 emissions quickly. What are the prospects of the Biden administration returning to these climate change policies that we agreed upon in the Paris Treaty?
Oh, 100%. I mean, the Biden administration has made it very clear that it is committed to multilateralism and to addressing climate change. And it's not only said it, the people they have appointed, many of whom I know well, are absolutely committed to these two things, multilateralism and dealing with climate change. So this is not just rhetoric. I'm very firmly convinced that it will happen. And the fact that the Democrats won both of the Georgia seats means that we now control, the Democrats control the Senate, the House, the administration, and these are elements that will be core to the policy agenda going forward. Building bridges with Europe, I believe, will be also very central. You know, it's not only multilateralism, but a commitment to democracy, and human rights more generally. That we recognize that what we care about are things like democracy and human rights and truth. You know, the Enlightenment values, if you want to put it that way, and what I talk about in my book, People, Power, and Profits. You know, these are deeply ingrained values that we've seen trampled on, and therefore we cherish even more because we've seen them at risk. So I'm really convinced that they will be an important part of the agenda going forward. And Europe is our ally, totally, on these issues of values and these issues of science and climate change, you know, and where the world is going. So on that, I feel very, very, very sure. Whether I think there's going to be some challenges, to use a euphemism going forward, is with the other side, with China. And the reason is there'll be a clear commitment that we believe in democracy and human rights. That runs into the problems of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. And you can't turn your back on the issue of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. you can deal with the problems of economic rivalries in many different ways. That's not the issue. And my concern was Trump tried to convert the issue into one of economic rivalry. Mm-hmm. I think we can deal with economic competition. I mean, you know, you and I are both economists, and we believe in competition as spurring us on. And you know, I believe in good antitrust laws. You have to have a good legal framework for regulating competition to make sure there's not exploitation. But I think competition is a spur to innovation. So I'm not worried about competition from China. And, you know, I think that is fundamentally good. And I do believe that we can develop rules of the road, that an international rule of law is as important for international commerce as a domestic rule of law is to domestic commerce. So that we need to construct an international rule of law. More difficult because there isn't a agreement on the underlying, you might say, philosophical, economic order. So that makes it more difficult. When you think about the world in different ways, getting the right rules is going to be more difficult. But I am very convinced that we can find a set of rules that we think is fair and reasonable. You know, not ideologically driven. A lot of the old rules were driven by a belief in a neoliberal model of market fundamentalism. Those didn't serve a lot of people in both developed and developing countries well. But I think we can get an agreement on a rule of law. We'll have to address some really hard issues. Most importantly, the tech giants, which raise issues of competition, speech, political manipulation, incitement, hate speech, a whole set of issues that there's been a reluctance to deal with internationally, and I think we have to deal with it internationally. It's such a big part of what is going on today. But the point I wanted to raise is that internationally, figuring out how we deal with China and some of the other authoritarian, non-democratic governments is going to be the big challenge. Yeah. That we need to cooperate to deal with climate change, to deal with pandemics, to deal with the oceans. We need to cooperate. We can't pretend that we live on different planets. We share the same planet. So we have to cooperate, but we also have to recognize and respect our values about human rights and democracy.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you are saying. So first of all, I had the impression in the last 4 years that it's very difficult to be an ally of the US. During the Trump administration, he pushed away allies in international organizations and international rounds of debates. So I hope that with the Biden administration, things are becoming much better in that regard, and that Europe could demonstrate to a much larger extent the relation with the US, and also that it is an ally to the US, that we share our Western values, and therefore also have the potential and the possibilities to do something regarding human rights in China and in other parts of this world. So this is the first. The second is, when we are talking about things like climate change or so, we need to have agreements internationally that are attractive also for other countries to join. So for example, when we are able between the US and the EU to agree on a kind of climate club, as Bill Nordhaus has suggested that a few years ago, then this will be attractive for other countries to join as well, and also to apply measures against the CO2 emissions in coordination with each other. And third, I think, as you are saying, economic competition is not a problem for us economists as such. And also having competition between member countries of a polity, or also between states internationally, if this is only economic and there are some fair rules according to which everybody is playing, that's fine with us. But I fear that what we observe in the case of China is an extended nationalism to a larger extent. Not only Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, but also the pressure regarding Taiwan, also pressure on other countries around the world if they do not comply with the interests of the Chinese government, and so on. So I think this is quite difficult, or becoming quite difficult in the near future. And we have to face these problems together, the US and the European Union. It is not feasible to go on that each part of the world is going on its own in that respect, I think. Now we have at least the fundamental agreement, not in all details, but at least, the intention to have a kind of investment agreement between the EU and China. Do you think this is problematic for the new possibilities to join forces with the US, or do you think it will not hamper anything in that regard?
Oh, well, first, let me say, I'm not sure it's going to ever get past the European Parliament. At least some of what I hear is more skeptical of that. And that may be reflecting some of my concerns. The issue, in some sense, there are a whole set of issues concerning security, privacy, and you might even say fair competition. They're very difficult issues. And I don't pretend to know the answer. What I do think is really important is for the U.S. and its allies in Europe and New Zealand, Australia, to get together, in Japan, to get together to as an alliance of democracies committed to values about human rights, about privacy. We may not have exactly the same view, but basically we do. We respect these issues of political manipulation, incitement, hate speech, and so forth, and try to ascertain in a way that convinces our population about what are the appropriate responses of our societies to these. Right now, one of the most disturbing things is that we hear the Trump administration said Huawei is a security threat. And then some European countries said, no, it's not a security threat. Well, how is an ordinary citizen supposed to decide? They don't trust the Trump administration, but have the Germans put their economic interest over their security interest? It would be much better if we felt that there was a consensus about this being addressed forthright as issues of security, privacy, and the other issues that I talked about. And if there could be a broad consensus that we could go forward together, that would enable that's the only framework in which we're going to get a really sustainable solution to this set of problems. So to me, I think that there is a real need for this greater cooperation between U.S. and Europe. It's going to require, for Germany, it may be the most difficult because China is a big export market. It plays a bigger role in your economy than it does in America. For us, it's a big source of imports. We get our cheap clothing and lots of other things, but we can move those to Vietnam, but the export markets are harder to adapt. But it would be short-sighted to let the concern about selling cars overwhelm these broader issues of values, security, privacy. And so I think it is really important that there be a European, American, North Atlantic, global, Japan and Australia and New Zealand, consensus on how we respond.
Perhaps a new trade agreement would help, but still the US is the most important export market for Germany, more than China is. So of course we need to get our priorities right in that regard as well. China is a bit more dynamic, but yeah, it's
one aspect of that which I think Europe has been doing well, and I want to support. And interesting, at the last days of the Trump administration, they seem to have supported this in a paper they submitted to the WTO, and that is the imposition of duties on countries that don't cooperate in fighting climate change. Mm-hmm. The countervailing duties, whatever you want to call them, cross-border adjustments. There are different names for it, but that's part of the incentive system to make sure that everybody goes along. You mentioned a climate club. We have a club called the WTO. The WTO has said, I wrote this in my book in 2006, that it's okay to restrict imports from countries that don't comply with international agreements on climate. So we have a club, and the countries have been afraid to invoke that. Mm-hmm. And I hope Europe, Japan, the United States will muster up the nerve to do that. And I think that would change the incentives and get greater cooperation on climate change.
Yeah. What the Trump administration also did relatively in the end of its legislative term was somehow helping to have an agreement between United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is also quite an interesting outcome in the Middle East, when you think that this kind of alliance that's coming up between Israel and these Arabic states is somehow confronting Iran. And the question is, what will the Biden administration do in that regard when we think about the Middle East?
Well, I've not been very engaged at all with them on that, or people in them, potential people in the administration. So I can't really answer that very well. Let me just give my own view on that, which is that the Trump administration has really undermined the only possibility going forward for a democratic Israel, which is this two-state solution. And that the attempt to shore up a system in which you have what is effectively an apartheid system in that part of the world is doomed to failure. And that's what they've been trying to do. They're trying to get UAE and other countries to support Israelis' move to create an apartheid situation. And that's not going to work. So that's one problematic aspect. The second is that this conflict with Iran is been going on now for 40 years. And, you know, we can have our views about this form of an authoritarian state. You know, I don't like authoritarianism, whether it's a theocracy or what name you call it. But what I said earlier is we need to cooperate. We need to cooperate in a rule of law. We need to cooperate in climate change. We need to cooperate in pandemics. We also need to cooperate to make sure we don't have nuclear proliferation. That's an important issue. And that's where Europe and the United States under Obama had gotten together with, you know, to try to get a Middle East that was more stable and more nuclear free. And 4 years of the Trump administration has left us less secure. And so what we have to do is to try to do what we can to repair the damage of the last 4 years and try to get strength in the global commitment on nuclear deterrence.
If you allow me, we are almost running out of time, but a final topic I would like to ask you about is the strong polarization you have in the US. I remember the studies by Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal looking at roll call votes in Congress and trying to find out how close the different representatives and senators are to each other in political questions. This was continued by Keith Poole in the past, also in several other studies, and they were able to show that polarization in the US continued since the middle of the 1960s until recently, to a large extent. And somehow what we observed during the Trump administration, also last week, the turmoils at the Capitol, are an indicator of this strong polarization in the US. What do you think would be the best policies the Biden administration can do about that?
I mean, you put your finger on, I think, the worst problem the United States faces, the most serious, the extent of polarization. You know, I saw when I was in the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Politically, it began with Newt Gingrich, called Contract on America, a really strong political polarization in the country. Mitch McConnell, when Obama got elected, said he was going to do everything to make sure that Obama failed. It wasn't to do everything to make sure the economy, the U.S. succeeded. It was your first emphasis was hurting your enemy rather than helping your country by showing a different way. It's a really divisive agenda. Well, first let me say, I think Americans were really shocked by what happened on Wednesday with the attack on the Capitol. I think it may have been a moment of awareness that gone too far, that our democracy is at risk. So you're seeing reactions that are extraordinarily strong. So for me, that's one thing. This may be a moment of realization that we have to do something about it. As an economist, I can't help but put some emphasis on the economic divides that are very large and have grown, especially since the mid-70s, late 70s, very strongly. And if we don't do something about the economic divides, we are providing fertile field for demagogues like Trump And in my book in 2012, The Price of Inequality, I said, one of the consequences of this growing inequality, unless we do something about it, is it will be taken advantage by a demagogue. I didn't have Trump in mind, but he clearly seized the moment. So to me, these are at least two of the elements. A third, it goes back to the issue I talked about a minute earlier, and that is the issue of the tech giants, social media. When you allow incitement, spreading lies, misinformation, disinformation, you create a divided society. Mm-hmm. A majority of the Republicans actually believe the election was stolen. Trump keeps saying it. Many Americans don't believe climate change is real. And, everybody talks about other countries engaging in propaganda and the big lie. We now realize it's going on inside our country. It's not being foisted on us. It's part of us. And unless we find a way of dealing with it, it's going to be very hard for us to heal the divides.
Yeah, I think the hour that we have scheduled for tonight, after the technical problems that we faced, is over. It just ran in seconds, so to speak. It's been really an enormous pleasure to discuss these questions with you, to have this conversation. Thank you very much, Joe, for this wonderful discussion. And
thank you.
Let us hope that our optimism regarding the developments during this year in the US and in Europe and in our cooperation is coming real. So thanks to New York, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The sound not of one hand clapping, but maybe 3 or 4. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you, Professor Feld. Thank you for Friedrich Graf von Westphalen for hosting us here tonight. You covered a lot of ground. I think we'll all take home we have to cooperate. That's a beautiful motto, since we were cooperating with so many people here tonight on this event. So thank you all for joining us from everywhere within Germany and beyond. And I wanted to let you know how we'll continue our Transatlantic Tuesday next week with basically the last topic that you touched upon, more polarization. 2 conspiracy theory specialists, Professor Butter from the University of Tübingen and Professor Peter Knight from the University of Manchester, will discuss QAnon and the state of conspiracy theory. So please join us for that event. That'll take place on Zoom, so you have to register online at the Carl-Schurz-Haus webpage, and on following Tuesdays there will be Sarah Churchwell and Applebaum and many others joining us. All the best to you in New York, Professor Stiglitz.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and you all have a good night.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.